Canon's eye control autofocus isn't new, but for many of us, the EOS R5 Mark II will likely be the first time that we've had a camera that supports it. This is the final part of my 4-part mini-series looking at eye control autofocus on the R5 Mark II in depth. And this time I'm going to talk about my experience using it and some of the tips and tricks that I've found for trying to get the most out of it. However, much of what I'm going to cover in this video also applies to the EOS R1 and R3, though, at least in the case of the R3, the settings are found in different places in the menus. Finally, one big disclaimer for this video. Eye Control AF is only active and available when using the EVF. Now, because the EVF's display cannot be recorded externally, any demonstration of Eye Control AF you see in this video is simulated and is not the actual operation in camera being recorded. Now, before I get into this, I want to prefix it with a quick caveat. Over the last several years, I've become more of a video shooter than a still photographer. Even then, when I was doing a lot of photography, aside from birds in flight, I shot very little fast-paced action, like motorsports or regular sports. Now, with that in mind, my take here is coming from somebody who's, first, a bit rusty at the whole photography thing, and second, has been more focused on slower-paced landscape and product photography, and maybe wildlife is the most high-paced, fast-paced stuff that I've done, where in my experience, Eye Control AF just doesn't yield as much of a benefit as it does in faster-paced things like sports and action. Now, with that said, probably the biggest hurdle that I've had to jump through in this whole process of getting used to using Eye Control AF is actually just using it. I have been shooting with Canon cameras for the better part of 15 years, almost 2 decades actually, and the R5 Mark II is literally the first camera that I have had that has this capability. Put simply, that is a lot of muscle memory to overcome, and overcoming how I instinctively approach moving my focus points. Moreover, I also still shoot with my R5 and R5C on a regular basis, and so I still have cameras that feel the same, or I shouldn't say still, I have cameras that feel the same in my hand. The R5 Mark II and R5 are completely undistinguishable from the way you feel the grip, but one can't do eye control at all. This, of course, also poses some challenges, is for me at least, getting too into using or accustomed to using eye control gives me a hard time when I go back to my R5. So perhaps the first observation here of using eye control is actually just turning it on, getting it calibrated, and reminding yourself constantly that it's there, that you can use it. The more you do, the more you use it, the more comfortable you will get with it. And this is something I have certainly found over the past several months. The more you will also remember that it's actually there to be used in the first place, and that for me is really just the hardest part. Now, the next major hurdle that I had to get over is precision. As autofocus systems have developed over the last, well, since they started in the late 1980s, the camera has gotten more and more autofocus points, giving us more and more precision in placing that autofocus point in the frame. This is, of course, culminated with modern mirrorless cameras like any of the EOS R series that effectively allow you to put the AF point anywhere you can see in the screen or effectively on the sensor. I mean, if you take all of the individual focus point positions that you have on an R5 series camera, you end up with nearly 6,000 different places the point can be. Now, for me at least, a side of this has been a perception, or a side effect of this has been a perception as this has increased, that I need this level of pixel-perfect precision to put the AF point exactly where I imagine it should be to make an image I want. Now, stepping over to eye control, one of the first things that frustrated me when I just started using it was the lack of precision that I had compared to using the multi-controller or touch and drag AF. you cannot put something on a specific pixel in the frame. However, in reality, the truth is, and took me a little while to sort of realize, is that kind of precision isn't really necessary. I would say in most applications, but really in general. Now, that said, the efficiency of eye control depends a lot on what you're trying to do with it. And my experience has been that using it with, say, spot or single AF to focus precisely on things is not the best use case, and it's not really the best way that I would go about doing it. On the other hand, when you combine it with subject detection and tracking, the camera can actually infer what subject you're trying to have it track simply by having the eye control pointer near a detected subject. It doesn't have to be directly on top of it. In this latter case, this is where I think eye control, combined with that subject detection process, really shines in fast-paced situations. You don't have to focus and recompose or try to move the autofocus point around with touch and drag AF or the multi-controller or something like that to select a subject you want to focus on. Just look at the player and hit the autofocus start button, and you should have things, again, if everything's calibrated and working for you that day, you should have that person in focus with the eye control system. Now, that said, if the eye control pointer is far enough away from a detected subject and there is something the camera can track under it, I have found that the eye control pointer will tell the camera to track that instead. So there is a little bit of a cautionary point to be had there. So I guess perhaps the second point that I want to try to make here goes to people, again, like me, who may be disinclined to use eye control because after you first tried it, you realized eye control of the AF point can't put it exactly on the pixels that you think you should put it on. The reality is that just doesn't matter that much. And this is especially true in fast-paced shootings, but I found even in more mundane or sedate situations, it works just fine more than often than not. Moreover, when you have the time and need for precision, eye control can be used to get you close quickly, and then you can use the multi-controller or touch and drag to do that final alignment, and therefore they could be set to be slower and less jumpy and give you even more precision. Though, quite honestly, in my experience, when shooting in those kinds of situations, I normally use the LCD and therefore can't use eye control anyway, so it doesn't help in that case. Now, I did say I was going to talk about camera setup and settings, so what about those? Well, first off, I am an unabashed rear button focusing user. I've done it a couple of videos on how I have my camera set up, including the dual rear button setup that I normally use, where I have one button set to basically one shot with a small autofocus point, and the other button is set to immediately go to servo, often with a larger autofocus area. Now, in that vein, one of the first things I did was change my shutter's half press function from the default of move the AF point, meter, and start with eye control to the rear button AF required metering only. Now, that said, if you're not a rear button focusing user, I'm not sure the new default is really what you want to use anyway. With it, every time you half press the shutter button, the camera is going to move the autofocus point or select a subject, hopefully the one you're looking at, but you have no control over that. So probably might want to change that back to just autofocus and metering if you go that way. Now, on top of this, while I have mostly gotten past my issues with the eye control cursor not being pixel exact, there are times where it's not right at all. It just simply is all over the place. This could be either because of lighting conditions or because my eye isn't exactly where it was behind the camera when I did the calibration or something like that. Now, in those cases, I don't want the camera putting the focus point wherever willy-nilly to take a picture. And again, that's part of the shutter button situation. Now, to address all of this, at least until I find something better, I have set my autofocus on button to just be my normal autofocus and metering start with no extra customizations, the same way I have always done it without eye control. I then set my exposure lock, the star button, to the move AF point, AF start with eye control function. I don't actually use exposure lock, so it's fine for me. This also continues to start the metering and autofocus even when the camera has eye control disabled, so it might actually be better to switch those and have the autofocus on button also be my old dual button thing, but I'll have to give that a try at some point. Now, this configuration, the way I described it, unfortunately means that I've lost that quick way to switch between precise one-shot setups and larger tracking servo setups, but if I switch them around, that might actually work just fine. Though I would point out also, due to a variety of circumstances, namely I don't shoot birds nearly as much or at all anymore, that I haven't actually run into a problem with this yet, but it really would be nice to have the option to enable that the way it used to be on the eye control servo button, or find a better workaround. I'm not really sure there. Now, as for the eye control system itself, the first thing I did is turn down the sensitivity a little. I keep mine at -1 instead of 0 the vast majority of the time, and I find for my eyes this helps get the camera to do what I want a little bit better and smoother. I also changed my cursor color to purple, and I bounce around on some of the other settings, but at least in the case of the purple cursor, it's not as immediately obvious as the white or orange is, and so I don't really see it stand out to the point where I feel like I have to turn eye control off to not be distracted by it. So with that said, this wraps up my 4-part mini-series looking at eye control AF. If you're new to the whole eye control AF thing since getting an R5 Mark II, I hope you found this useful. Now, if you've been using it for ages, for example, you had an EOS R3, and you have any good tips or tricks that you've found useful, please let us know in the comments. I'm always looking for better ways to do things, and the more time you have with stuff like this, the better you are at using it. That said, I hope you found this useful, or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. Also, if this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us for free by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a comment with your experiences. Likewise, you can support us by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.